Hi, I'm Adam and I'm recording this video on chatwithgleneric.com. Today we're going to be talking about positions where one side has a queen and the other side has a pawn that's one square away from promoting. So in order to win this position with the queen, we'll have to stop the pawn from promoting and bring our king closer so we can eventually capture the pawn. Now, there are some situations where this is a win and some where it's a draw. So today we're going to go through 3 different examples that should cover all of them. The first example will do the e-pawn, but it's the exact same whether it's an e-pawn, a d-pawn, a b-pawn, or a g-pawn. These will all be won the exact same way. After that, we'll go through if it's a c-pawn or an f-pawn, and we'll explain why this is a draw. And lastly, we'll go through if it's an a-pawn or a h-pawn, which will also be a draw. So the ones we're remembering is a, h, c, and f are draws, barring some circumstances, but they're mostly draws. And B, D, E, and G. Let's go through the winning technique first. So the only way we can really stop this pawn from promoting is to force White's king to move in front of the pawn. Because otherwise, if let's say we move our king, for example, White would just promote, and it'll be a draw. So we need to find a way to force the king in front of the pawn, or to pin the pawn, but forcing the king in front seems more effective. And this is why our first move in this position is queen to d6 check. So now our queen attacks the pawn and attacks the king, and White's king only has 2 squares. So if White's king moves away to c8, we'll simply capture the pawn. And we'll win this position easily. So for that reason, White's king has to move out in front of the pawn. And now this is important to remember. Every time our opponent's king moves in front of the pawn, we now have time to move our king closer, because they can't promote in this turn anymore. So now let's say White's king goes to, we'll say f7. Yeah, f7. Because if the king were to go to f8, it wouldn't really be as effective because the pawn would be pinned, so it wouldn't be able to push. So now we need to find a way to force the king back in front of the pawn. So there are a few ways we could do this, but I'm going to suggest starting with the move queen to d7, where the promote because it will be check. So now White has a couple of options, and none of them are really tempting. So first of all, if White goes king f6, king g6, or king f6 we'll say, so it doesn't lose the pawn. Now we can play the move queen e8, and we've effectively blocked the pawn from promoting. So now White will have to play a move like this, and we can eventually force the king away from the pawn, and we can capture it. So king f6 wouldn't do. So that's why in this position, White would play the move king to f8. So now we need to force the king back in front of the pawn again. If we play the move queen d6, they'll just repeat, and we'll have to start again. If we ever check the king, they can block the check by promoting. So for that reason, we're going to play the move queen to f5 check. So now obviously if White's king moves in front of the pawn, we have time to move our king again, because whenever our opponent's king moves in front of the pawn, we can bring our king forward. So that won't do. So let's say White's king runs away from the pawn. We'll say it's a g8. So now they're claiming that they're going to stay between these 2 squares. So the pawn is always threatening to promote. So we'll never have time to move our king, because they'll always promote whenever we move it. So in this position, we're going to play the move queen to g6 check. So we're cornering the king and trying to force it back towards the pawn. So if they play king h8, queen f6 check will win the pawn. And if they go king f8, then we get the exact same setup we got at the start of the game, except our king is on f8 instead of d8. So whenever we get this setup, we play the move queen to f6 check. And now again, if they step away from the pawn, we'll capture the pawn. So they have to step in front of the pawn, and we move our king closer again. And then we can repeat the exact same process. So the king moves out, although this one will be quicker because our king is supporting a lot of squares. So the king moves out, we force the king back in front of the pawn again with queen d6, because again, if it moves away, we'll capture the pawn. So king e8, and now we'll play the move king f6. And now we've successfully forced got our king up to support our capturing of the pawn by forcing white's king in front of the pawn repeatedly. So now white's only legal move is king to f8, and it'll be a checkmate in 2 moves. So the important thing to remember in the one with the e pawn or the d pawn or the b pawn or the g pawn is that the way we win this position is by using our queen to force white's king in front of the pawn, and then every time white's king blocks the pawn's queening square, we can then move our king up. So okay, now that we understand how to play for a win, let's have a look at some examples where it's a draw. So the first one we're going to look at is the c pawn, and at first glance it looks like we can do the exact same thing and win the exact same way. So queen d6, king c8, bring the king up, and this is all well and good. And after this move, or king b7, we'll say king b7 because that's what we looked at last time. If we go for the exact same technique, like this, in this position, we're going to get a nasty surprise, because now the main difference between the c pawn and the e pawn is that when we get into this position, white doesn't have to move in front of the pawn. Now, white can play the very sneaky move, king to a8, and there's no way for us to make progress. So let's have a look at our options here. So first of all, if we and this is the important one, if we take the pawn, it will be stalemate. White's king has no legal squares it can move to. Our queen covers them all. So we can't capture the pawn, or it'll be stalemate. If we move our king up, white will promote, and it'll be a draw because we'll be playing queen versus queen. So we'll have equal material, and there'll be no checkmate. So if we move our king up, it will also be a draw. And if we check white's king, white will simply move back to b8, where they're threatening the queen again, and after we check again, they'll just repeat into the corner. So for this reason, with the c pawn, there's no way to win most of the time. So okay, let's move on to our last example, and this one will also be a draw. This will be queen versus a pawn, and this one is very similar to the c pawn, but slightly different. And the point with this one is after we go check to force the king in front of the pawn, now if we move our king, again it's stalemate because the pawn can't move and the king has no squares to move to. So this again will be stalemate. So the reason the A, H, C and F pawns are draws is because the white king has lots of stalemating tricks. So thank you very much for watching, and goodbye.